Welcome to Now and Then Again, the podcast that explores the timeless spiritual wisdom of Henri Nouwen and how his words continue to inspire, challenge, and guide us today. I'm Wendy Vanderwall Martin, and in this very special episode, we're taking you back to Henri's years at Harvard University, a rich and formative time in his life and ministry. Joining us are four of Henri's former assistants who knew him well during those remarkable years: Jim Smith, Michael O'Loughlin, Barbara Prey, and Peter Weiskel. Together, they'll share personal stories, reflections, and lessons that bring Henri's spirit and humanity vividly to life once again. Now, before we begin, if you'd like to deepen your own connection with Henri's wisdom, we invite you to sign up for our free daily meditations, short, inspiring reflections from Henri's writings delivered right to your inbox. You can subscribe and learn more about all our programs at henrinouwen.org. And mark your calendars. In 2026, just a short few months away, we'll gather to celebrate the 30th anniversary Henri Nouwen Conference, a special opportunity to honor Henri's enduring legacy and explore how his teachings continue to shape our world today. Details and registration are available through our website. Now, let's turn back the clock and listen in as Jim, Michael, Barbara, and Peter take us inside the Harvard years, the laughter, the struggles, and the grace of life shared with Henri Nouwen. So what a wonderful opportunity to all be in the same room, at least the same Zoom room. Welcome to Jim and to Barbara, to Michael, and to Peter. So glad you're here.
Thank you so much.
Great to be here.
It's a privilege.
Now, each of you knew Henri, and you knew him in a very particular season of his life, the years he was at Harvard University. And so I wanted to begin by simply giving each of you an opportunity to talk about the ways that you experienced Henri and perhaps some of the deepest seeds that Henri planted in your life and how they've borne fruit in the years since those early 80s at Harvard. Jim, I've gotten to know you, so I'm going to invite you to go first. We'll hear from you and then maybe just shoot it to the next person so that we can keep the conversation moving.
I first met Henri actually when I'd finished my MDiv program at Bethel Seminary in Minnesota and was looking, as my wife Linda and I were praying through next steps. One of my interviewers at Yale was Henri, of all people, 1975. And Yale's a beautiful campus there, as several of us know. And it was just a delight to meet him. He was just at that time, of course, coming out with the book Reaching Out, which was a movement into Christian spirituality, not simply combining theology with psychology. And so the conversation had an element of that in it, personal interest. He's dropped everything to interview this kid who had at that time a brown beard. And it was just a delightful time. And I thought, I'll read his works, but I'll never meet him again, probably. Lo and behold, he came to Harvard in the 80s. I, by that time, was doing a THD in church history, Doctor of Theology. And so it was an absolute delight. And I was pastoring a church in the Dorchester section of Boston, which is a lively area and a very special one. And in studying with Henri, found that there were applications from what he was teaching that were so significant to pastoral ministry as the church was growing in Dorchester area. And what would it mean to have this kind of blended congregation? One of the keys to that, maybe others of us echo this, was the issue of hospitality. And so it was hospitality at the 2006 conference in Toronto. I gave a talk on Christian witness as hospitality, and deciding that you're not simply a guest that everyone should treat in a certain way, and you bring a high degree of oughtness to every situation. Here's how it ought to be, and here's how I ought to be seen. But you, instead of being a guest, you're a host, the root word of hospitality. Henry was marvelous with words, with etymologies, with finding the right words, with stringing out some of the depths of meaning. And so it was in that time frame that I began to say, I want to be a host. I want to offer a non-preoccupied space. I want to meet people where they are. As I've said later, I don't want to be an automatic transmission. I just show up and be who I want to be, but I'm a stick shift. I go into whatever gear the person's in. Pardon me if that's too blue collar, but that's my background. And so that was wonderful and has remained so in pastoral ministry, Boston, Minneapolis, San Diego, still an associate pastor part-time here, still teaching.
Being a host and learning from Henry the deep roots of what true hospitality is. Thank you, Jim.
Yes.
Michael, how about you? What deep seeds did Henry sow and deposit in your life when you were with him at Harvard?
Well, I'll do like Jim, and I'll tell you how I met Henry. I was working in a Christian bookstore in Harvard Square, and Henry was being shown around by the dean of Divinity School, and he came in, and I was introduced to him, and then later on I saw him again, and at the school, and he said, "Oh, you're a student too," and I said, "Yes," and he said, "Oh, that's great because I need some aides." So he hired me after 1.5 conversations to be his aide, and it was I was happy to do it. I was doing some very serious stuff. At least I thought it was serious at Harvard, and spending time with Henry over there was like recreation for me. It was time away from learning languages and working on ancient matters, and so it was great to have Henry around. But I didn't take him as seriously as I probably should have. I was reading all these big books and talking to all these big people, and Henry was just something different. So I underestimated Henry, and probably it was because he was right there. I had him right in my house on many occasions, and it was only later when I left Harvard and I stopped having contacts with anybody else who I'd been with at Harvard except Henry. Henry stayed the course, and my appreciation for Henry began to grow. He's somebody who grew on me, and he became more and more important. There was a point in my life when I decided to become a spiritual director, and I started at that point to really lean on my relationship with Henry just to get started and to know what I was supposed to do. And I think that the greatest teaching that I came away with from Henry was his teaching in the book, The Return of the Prodigal Son, about becoming the father. I read that, and as I was getting older, I have a son who's in his 30s. I have 3 grandchildren. I'm getting on in years, and this idea of becoming the father has become really a linchpin in my dealings with people. What I try to do now, in the spirit of that book, is I try to be the father, be the one who reconciles, be the one who welcomes home, the one who accepts and supports others, particularly young people. It's led me to have special relationships with some of my nieces and nephews. It's led me to have special relationships with other young people, and to try in all the relationships that I'm in to be the father and to offer people shelter, offer people understanding, offer people affection. And that's what perhaps the greatest teaching that I've taken from Henri. I ultimately went on to write some books about Henri. And I even wrote a book in his name. That is, his book, Jesus the Gospel, was actually written by me. So I really ended up being very involved with Henri, but it was all after I left Harvard and when I realized what a great, great person he was.
Thank you, Michael. It just made me think of we this year, in the year leading up to the 30th anniversary conference of Henri's death next year, we have a cohort of 30 young leaders who are age 30 and under. And they're being mentored and they're part of the cohort with peer learning. And they're each doing a project, integrating Henri in some way into their own context. And a number of them had very lofty project ideas starting out. And we're getting to halfway through the project. And a number of them have said, my project has evolved, and really, I just think I need to write my reflections on how Henri has guided me. They didn't quite use the words, but in a way they were saying how Henri has been like the father to me, been that host, been that accompanier. So I think that fruitfulness that Henri so hoped for after his death has continued through each of you, but also as young people encounter him, they are finding what he so longed to be, which was the father. Thank you, Michael. Barbara, I wonder if you would speak next about a lingering legacy of Henri in your life as an artist.
One of the most important times working with Henri was being with this group of people. I think it was just, someone had mentioned hospitality, but and correct me if I'm wrong, I think we had lunch every Tuesday and Thursday after class. Is that correct? Michael, Jim?
Yes.
Yes.
And those times, I mean, we were all very different, but those times were really, really special. And there's so much to take away from those times, our discussions, your different perspectives, Henri, and then seeing what he did while I lived, I was a commuter, I lived in Ipswich. But to see what he did on Friday nights, and I remember we put together the Haiti trip, and I remember deciding with one of you, I think, choosing the students who would go on the Haiti trip. But there was so much more. It wasn't just I had taken his spiritual life class the year before, so luckily I was kind of a little prepared. But there was so much more that he did outside of just lecturing in the classroom, that I think it would be important to mention too, because he really went far beyond. I remember he would, and again, I am Protestant, so you have to help me, Peter and Michael. But he would have services, and I remember his icons. I have icons in my house, thanks to Henri. And I bought a real one, thanks to Henri. But he's influenced, the major influence on my life has been being my grandfather and great grandfather were both presidents of Lutheran seminaries. So I grew up very Protestant, and Henri really opened my eyes to Catholic spirituality, and I think for so many of us, he did. That was his bridge, that he brought this whole a sense of spirituality to a lot of people who just didn't have it. And I'm very grateful for him. We continue. My husband is actually speaking of needing spirit, Presbyterian minister, and we have a Taizé service because we went to visit Taizé because of Henry on our, I think on our, after I came back from a loose grant. So there are many, when my daughter was born, he gave her a beautiful cross. I think I had mentioned this. So my memory of Henry, I have a cross by my bed that he had given to me. He gave me, I have a Catholic prayer book that I still use hopefully every morning. But it was just an honor to be able to work with him and to see what he was, as Michael said, such a normal person. I mean, I think, and we can all, this is my image of Henry lecturing. His hands are always moving. He wore the same, and I'm an artist, so I would say that, the same blue sweater all the time. And he would, he was so articulate and just a really wonderful human being with obviously a deep faith.
Thank you. Thank you. As I was saying before we started recording, for those of us who never met Henry, but feel like we know him through reading his books, hearing some of these stories from all of you is a wonderful way of connecting to this person, this embodied, Henry's not just writing. Henry was a person who brought a way of being in the world forward, and to hear your stories helps that come alive for many of us, some of us who he had passed away before we were even born already. So Peter, how about you? How did you know Henry at Harvard, and what are the lingering seeds that have taken root in your life through his ministry with you?
Okay.
Well, Peter was important. I remember you at your desk all the time.
That's right. I was actually Henry's, I guess the best word is secretary or assistant.
Assistant.
And basically was sort of a gatekeeper at the carriage house. Nobody's mentioned the fact that he lived in a little house that was built next door to the dean's much more imposing house. And it was just the right size for having small groups of people over to talk and have good times together. But I want to go back before Harvard for a minute, because I first met Henry when I was an undergraduate at Yale, back around about 4 years before I was there at Harvard, 4 or 5 years. And he was very much more inhibited, I would say, strangely enough, in those early years at Yale. He got invited to speak or to give the sermon at Yale's Battelle Chapel. And I was working in the chaplain's office at that point as a freshman, and I got sent up just to let him, to kind of feel him out. They were interested to know what he was going to be preaching about. And he seemed very guarded at that time. And he had an assistant at Yale, John McGabgab. Some of you may know of him. But I tried to loosen things up a bit, and he finally came around and said, "Yeah, I'm looking forward to this opportunity to preach." And lo and behold, a book came out of it, and it's one of his earlier books in the 70s that he ended up putting out. It's like people have joked about Henry never had an unpublished thought, and in some sense, that was true of his writing. He certainly wrote lots of letters, personal letters, and had large correspondence in that way. But he was always had his eye open for how he could reach, a larger community. And as far as Harvard, again, I dealt with the mail and really felt privileged to be there at a time when many other very significant religious figures came and spoke partly because Henry was there and he was friends with them. Thinking of Gustavo Gutierrez, who came, and I remember Henry, who introduced him, said, the founders of Harvard would be very upset if they knew that one Catholic priest is introducing another Catholic priest to give an address. His classes, which were attended by, it seemed like, every possible variety of student, and some who weren't students were there and hanging from the rafters at some points because it got so crowded in the Braun room. But he also had, as Michael said, a lot of friendships that got started at Yale, and another example, really the most important one of working with Henry, was when he invited me to come with him to visit a friend of his named John Vesey, who was a priest, a diocesan priest from New York City, who had volunteered to go to Guatemala, to Santiago Atitlan in Guatemala, right just after the worst of the violence there, where dozens of Catholic priests, many from America, from the US, had been killed during a period of time when there was tremendous repression going on in that area. And Henry basically said to his friend, John Vesey from New York, I want to come and visit with you. I want to come and be with you in the midst of this very difficult situation. And Henry then invited me to come with him. He didn't want to go alone. And I should say that the violence had really subsided by the time we were there, which was, of course, I very much appreciated, because I was about to get married not long after the period we were going to be there. And as with so many other things that Henry got himself involved with, a book came out of it. And it was this book,
Grazie.
let's see, which I'm not sure is visible, but it's called Love in a Fearful Land, a Guatemalan story. And that book, I was fortunate to be asked to, he knew that I did photography, so I did a lot of photography for this book. The main thing I took away from that, our friendship, our really pretty long friendship, was his openness to every single kind of person that you can imagine. And you could tell from his friendships. One of his closest friends was a guy named Richard Allen White, who was a Marxist and an incredibly radical guy who had spent a lot of time in Latin America as well. He was very good friends, and most of you probably know this, with Fred Rogers, the great Fred Rogers, who had Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and worked with children. And I was fortunate to be there at the carriage house at one point when Fred Rogers came. He had said he wanted to come and see and meet Henry, and we had the best time. And there are many, many others, both well-known and completely unknown, who could say, I was a friend of Henry's. And it was that hunger for friendship on his part, but also his openness to every single kind of person you can imagine. And that's what I take away the most from the time I worked with him at Harvard.
Thank you,
So
Peter.
thanks.
Peter, I would like to follow up what you said with just a brief comment. I think it was Barbara who said that she was exposed to Catholic thinking and Catholic spirituality through Henri. And I know where she's coming from. But I want to say that Henri was um, Henri was the true Catholic in the sense that Catholon means including everybody. And that was Henri's policy. He was a bridge between the Protestant and the Catholic world. At one point, there was a survey done of Protestant ministers, and they all said that the writer who was most important and influential for them was Henri. So
Yes.
he was actually right there in, I think, because he worked for Protestant universities, he was freer to do things than he could ever have been if he was at some Catholic place. And Henri was bound and determined to be totally Catholic, but at the same time, to make that Catholicism so encompassing and so open-ended that most of the people he was influencing were Protestant.
Yes, you're absolutely right. He's done more for ecumenism than anybody else in the last century, easily.
I wonder if we could just unpack that a little bit more. It's not only that those who are not Catholic find Henri to be a profound guide. It's not only that they're reading his material. Henri embodied something at Harvard that went far beyond, interdenominational dialogue or ecumenical relations. There was something embodied in the way in which he built friendship and offered and engaged in hospitality. So I wonder if you could unpack that ecumenism a little bit more. What was it at Harvard that Henri embodied when we think about bringing people from different traditions, different backgrounds, different philosophies together in the same space?
I'll start. I just don't think it was at Harvard. I think it was all around the country. He filled a void that was needed, or that was people were searching, and he happened to be kind of after Thomas Merton. Then there was Henri, and he was so prolific with his writing. So many people read it. And influenced so many people at that, probably now too, but at that period.
One of the things that struck me was that along with Michael for 2 years being doctoral fellows, is that it was a Henri Nouwen course, but there were no Henri Nouwen books that were required. We were just like stunned, and what we did was focus on the Gospels. Spring of '84 on the Gospel of Luke, and then to up it a little bit in terms of witness, one might say. I think Michael has pointed that out significantly. In '85, doing the Gospel of John. And so the real center of it being on Jesus. I think that's one reason why I was talking to Harvey Cox at the 200th anniversary of Harvard Divinity some years ago. And Harvey was one of the, arguably the person he got along with best on the faculty. They just got along. And Harvey offered this course that was beautifully attended on Jesus over in the yard. And the focus was on Christ is Lord. Wendy, when you were out here visiting with us, and Hugo was there. Hugo now down in Latin America, and I pointed out the pamphlet when I asked Henri, just beginning to work with him, what should I know about where you've been recently, your recent years? And he handed me a booklet called Christ of the Americas, Dying and Rising and Coming Again. He says, read this, and you'll understand where I'm coming from. And the center was Christ. And so at the same time, was doing church history with people like George Hunston Williams. And I said to George at one point, studying history, we're walking across the yard, I said, how can you be so generous in treating all these different groups in your church history survey? And he said essentially, I don't deny the brokenness or the splintering, but the real issue is no one group can express the fullness of Christ. And that just rang a bell. That's been part of the center of my ministry ever since. And that's something that both Henri and Harvey, I think, really were centered on, and that was part of the spiritual core of their friendship. Does that make sense to others of us?
Yes, these schools, Yale and Harvard Divinity Schools, are not denominational. They are, there's lots of different kinds of people there, Christian, non-Christian, Jewish. And so Henri didn't do that at Harvard. It already was there. And I'll make a comment about Jim's mention about Jesus. When Henri came back the second year, he made an aside to me. He said, I'm going to do John this year. And I guess we both kind of understood what that meant, because in the Synoptic Gospels, the realization of who Jesus is comes slowly. But in John, it's right out there. It's in the first sentence. Jesus is God.
Yep.
And so Henri, after his first year, which was more tentative, he was listening, he was trying to understand where people were coming from. In the second year he was there was quite different, and he was much more emphatic and much more evangelical, much more clear about the importance of Christ. And there were some who didn't like that in his classes, and some who left. But most accepted it. Henri wasn't in the carriage house all the time he was there. He was, the first year he was in a regular office, and he had all these assistants, and it was really funny. It was actually very funny to be in that office, because the phone would ring and 5 people would reach for the phone, and there just wasn't room for us there. So it was great that we finally got the space to be over at the carriage house. And it was, Henri had come from thinking about monasticism. And when he saw the carriage house, he said, I'm going to set this up in a more communal fashion. And he had us having meals there together and talking around the table. And that was him trying to bring that kind of spirituality to us at Harvard. He was bringing monastic style living, the community living, to us. And what a brilliant thing that was.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And was that quite a unique experience then for Harvard, that sort of monastic form of spirituality and hospitality? And after he left, what lingered, if anything, from what Henri did in the carriage house?
I'm just going to jump in. Michael, or Peter, didn't Henri pay for everything himself?
Yes.
That was my understanding. So there was a lot
Yes.
going on. There was a lot of food. There were a lot of people. There were a lot of events, which he covered.
That's right. He did. And yeah, he was very, very generous in that
Generous.
respect. Generosity. And when I traveled at his invitation, he was certainly covering my costs too, to fly to Guatemala and to France and etc. And yeah, I hear what you mean, that the personal relationships he had all over certainly Europe and the US and in Latin America. It was a very big net that he was part of, and he was always connecting, and that was very much the case after one of the year and a half I worked with him after he left Harvard.
I wonder, we know now that Henry had also very painful times being at Harvard. He found it a difficult environment, and we know that he eventually discerned a transition to L'Arche. Were those things that he talked about with you as younger assistants or students, or those who were working alongside him in that context?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Peter even had to take him for walks to try and get him to not be so stressed. He was at times quite miserable. He had meltdowns at Harvard on a regular basis.
Yeah. Well, yeah, maybe I've put some of that out of my own mind, but you're right. It's true.
Mhm.
I remember that. Yes.
Can I share a brief story, Wendy? Is that okay? And it would be this, one of the most moving times working with Henry for me was when all these things, as has been mentioned, at the carriage house and in all these other community aspects, and what an amazing interaction with so many people. And I was pastoring a church on the other end of the red line, near Ashmont Station in Dorchester. We're hatching kids, and Linda and I couldn't be at everything. So I went to Henry at one point and I said, paraphrase, and I said, Henry, I just can't be at everything. I'm sorry. I'd love to be there. I'm sorry, but I've got other things going on. And maybe you ought to find somebody else that could fill these shoes, that would be a better teaching fellow for you alongside Michael and the team. And Henry looked back with that expression and he said, "You really don't understand, do you?" I didn't know what was coming next. But he said, "You really don't understand." He said, "I need you because you're a living reminder that this campus and this community in Cambridge isn't all there is. That there are churches out there, that there are people out there, that there's all this world." And he said, "Honestly, I have to keep my eyes on that regularly. This isn't all there is." And so that whole need to go beyond it, the need for fresh air, if you will, or room to breathe. So Henry's saying, "You remind me that this isn't all there is." He says, "I want you to stay and let this be fruitful." And I thought, that's right to the heart of my soul, right to the core. Yeah. So that was important time.
I have to say that Henry was very generous with me, and when I was having trouble later in my life, Yuta Ayer told Henry, and Henry called me and said, "Come up to Toronto and let's talk." And he paid for the trip. And he was always paying for things for me. And I've got many things here in my office that I've received as a gift from Henry. His generosity was so meaningful. It was again, he had become the father, and the generous father at that. And it's been, I wish I could live up to his example. I try in my small way. I wanted to tell you guys a story that I remember from those days, that was pure Henry. He was at St. Paul, which is the Catholic church, and he was giving a talk there in the evening in their basement.
In Cambridge.
It's a big room. And he was up on stage, and at some point when he was just getting started talking to people, he was asked to speak up because there were people who were in wheelchairs beyond the doors who were having trouble hearing. Well, any of us would have just spoken a little louder, correct? Henry dove off the stage to go find these people and see what the story was. That was Henry.
Now, I did want to ask you
Yeah.
about some of the tensions that Henry experienced because of his focus on Jesus, being Jesus-centered. And one of you already mentioned Gutierrez was there, liberation theology and being justice-shaped. And apparently, my understanding is that at some point there was an accusation of spiritual imperialism in Henry's teaching because he was so Jesus-centered. Now, how do you think that impacted Henry, and in what way maybe did that cause him to think deeply about the pluralistic environment he was at with being at Harvard?
Well, I think that the spiritual imperialism is a loaded word, right? It's a bad word. And so this is an accusation that Henry's being this big force that is stomping on the sensibilities of smaller people. And it's, when you saw Henry and his entourage, it did look a lot like Jesus had returned to earth. I mean, there was, he was had such a big personality, and people just flocked to him. And many times I thought that it was that in Catholicism, we ask that priests, we think that priests are alter Christus, like another Christ. And that was what Henry was actually doing. Most priests can't do it. But it was the case for Henry. And so I think with the emphasis on Jesus and with the power of everything that was happening, it was natural for some people to find that it was not the humble thing that they expected. Now, this was nothing unusual for Henry. For example, when he went from Harvard to L'Arche, he did it in a big long caravan with all these cars and trucks, and I think Peter was along for the ride. And so they stopped at the monastery, the Cistercian monastery of Father John Bamberger on the way up. Well, that was totally disruptive, and the monks were not happy to see Henry with all these people and all this stuff, and even when they arrived up in Toronto, and they still talked about the shock it was just to see Henry roll in with all his stuff and all his people. So that's just part of the whole Henry way. It wasn't always appreciated.
Wendy, I see I'm looking to your right is an icon. And something I had wanted to mention that Henry loved was the Rembrandt painting of the prodigal son. And also his icons were always front and center on his altar or in his space. And that was very important for him. And he just loved the hand on the prodigal son.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
This is part of his European background. He is a very cultured person.
He was,
so
yes.
he knew quite a bit about art. And so he wrote about art, and he thought about art, and this was another aspect of him uh, that was quite refreshing and quite wonderful.
Mhm.
Right. But you had opportunity to engage with Henry about
Right.
art.
And we did,
So tell
we
us
spoke
about
about the
that.
Rembrandt, we spoke about the Rembrandt painting. And as I said, I think the hands for him were really, really important. If I
Hmm.
recall, and you could help me on this, all of you, he had a print of it um, leaning against a wall someplace in the carriage house. That was so important for him.
You know, we have a number of different live conversations with those connected to the Henri Nouwen community, the Henri Nouwen Society. And we invite people into spiritual practice. And we often are using Visio Divina, which for some folks is a new adventure in spirituality that they haven't experienced before. And I often say the return of the prodigal son is like a beautifully extended Visio Divina, because
Hmm.
I think Henry could linger in that space like perhaps many of us wouldn't find as easy. Now, Michael, you were speaking about Jonas earlier, and that funny description of Henry saying that when he tried to be contemplative, it was like monkeys jumping in a banana tree. And of course, at Jonas's retreat center, Henry didn't always have such an easy time being
I can
still
see
and being
that.
quiet. And yet, with art, it would seem that he could enter and be just mesmerized and enamored for hours at a time. And so it just strikes me just the beautiful sensitivity of his giftedness when it came to visual art.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I think one of the striking things for me also is that in later interaction with Henry, and I was glad this was included in the book, there's not only this beautiful, beautiful painting that we're speaking of, but there was the earlier presentation of what Rembrandt had done. Remember that? And in that, the prodigal son looks gnarly, and it's outdoors and it's a spectacle. And that was an era in Rembrandt's own life in which he was sort of a mess. And one of the things Henry said is, we don't all write our theology. Sometimes we paint our theology. And that's evidenced by the movement between those earlier. There's another sketch of the prodigal son, as I recall, in some kind of dive. And his wife is shown as a model in that, which is a little scary. But the movement that Rembrandt had, we paint our theology, we express it in music, we do it in other ways. That's where I think the beautiful songs that were sung, Ubi caritas et amor Deus ibi est, great message. So I love that progression that I saw, and it opened my eyes to ways in which people grow, even if they don't put it into words, for example. And we celebrate, as Henry said, each movement in the right direction, each movement toward life and toward the Lord.
Mhm. Thank you.
The artist who was most important to Henry was Van Gogh.
Mm.
And
They're both
you know,
Dutch.
Yes.
they're both Dutch.
Why not?
They're both nuts. And they both were capable of great extremes, heights of insight, and then also the deepest of despairs. And they're both so very emotional, and so Henry had a great uh, uh, passion for Vincent van Gogh. I think he identified with Vincent van Gogh, and I suppose all of you have heard the story of one time he went to a society to give a talk somewhere, and he said he was going to talk about Vincent, and this was a group of nuns that he was um, speaking to, and he got very dramatic and theatric, and even bandaged his ear, and he was he was he was Vincent, and he looked at the nuns, and they were all horrified, and and when it was finished, he said, "So it was really hard for you to listen to." And they said, "We thought you were going to talk about our founder, Vincent de Paul."
Good.
Well, one of the questions overarching this conversation has been, what seeds did Henry deposit at Harvard? What seeds did Henry deposit at Harvard, and what has borne fruit? And I think the friendship and the sense of community amongst the four of you and others who were with Henry at Harvard is certainly one of those fruits. And so it's really been a delight to feel like I get to be in on this conversation as you reminisce and remember Henry. We have a significant conference coming up, Longing for Home, the prophetic witness of Henri Nouwen in a Wounded World. Will be May 14 to 16, 2026, commemorating 30 years since Henry's untimely death. And this conference shows, I think, the movement from the early years when it was very much the circle of Henry's friends who came and remembered and gathered together, to being now a conference that's welcoming 30 young leaders who Henry was long gone before they were born. And it's a feeling of the deep spiritual deposit that Henry has given so many of us as we practice a spirituality that is Catholic in the sense of universal, and drawing in so many people to a way of being in the world that's so necessary today in the midst of such fracture and division and pain. And so as we look ahead to this conference, first, I hope all of you will make plans to be there, and that those listening will have opportunity to have one-on-one conversations with you at the conference as those who knew Henry personally. But also, I wanted to ask and to end our conversation with this question. What do you think Henry's prophetic witness is? We're in 2025, we're looking ahead to 2026. As we think about the world and the state that it's in now, what is Henry's prophetic witness from your experience of knowing him and continuing to engage with his spiritual wisdom over these it's close to 40, 45 years since you were with Henry at Harvard?
Wow, that's a long time. Well, I'll start. And let me first say that I'm always so embarrassed when I talk to someone who tells me, for example, I only saw Henry once. He was so great. It changed my life. I had Henry around my own house and in my own life for years before I really understood how absolutely central he was for me. I just feel so dumb. Anyway, what I think that Henry would say about our modern world is, I don't think he would approve of it at all. I think that all of our concern about AI and about I think that all of the polarization in this country, everything that is front and center in the news would seem absolutely wrong to Henry, and it seems wrong to me. And I think that Henry's would be a very prophetic voice about authenticity, about humanity, about equality. I think he'd have an awful lot to say. I think that everything that he says in his books speak to our world in a contrary way, saying all these things you're doing are wrong.
Thank you, Michael. Peter, thoughts on this question?
Yes, I would say that very much agreeing with with what Michael said. My sense is that for Henri, everything was about personal relationships. You know, he was not, though he gave tremendous talks and was eloquent in that way, it was all about the one-to-one relationships that he had that I think gave him meaning. And it's just in a world, a country, for example, now in this country where we've become so divided, so really nasty in certain ways to each other, to people who we disagree with. I think the message, Henri's message, that the most unlikely people that you can think of have something to teach you, and that we're all here in order to build friendship. I think friendship is the key word, because he was an unbelievable friend in terms of the numbers of people, but also the depth of his friendships. And we sort of need that now more than ever across all boundaries of politics and gender and other sources of things that can be divisions. So
Thank you.
that's what I would say.
Thank you. Barbara, thoughts on that? What would Henri say to a wounded world?
I think he would stay the course, and he would, what he was doing in his consistency, and be who he was, and be who he would be during this time.
Pastor Jim?
Mm-hmm. Well, you use the word prophetic to speak into the situations. I can't picture an argument with Return of the Prodigal Son as being a favorite. My own personal favorite of Henri's is Life Signs. And that grew in many ways out of some of the teaching he did in our years together. Published a couple of years later and centered on John 15. And in that intimacy, fruitfulness, and joy, intimacy, fecundity, and ecstasy, if you will. And I think that's a prophetic word. Let's have a perfect love triumph over our fears. And so let's lead with that. Fruitfulness. I can't produce a great society around me or all kinds of outcomes, but I can be fruitful with the Lord's work within me and in planting seed and giving opportunities. And ecstasy, we stand outside ourselves, ecstasis, and we find a joy, once again, in every movement in the right direction. And celebrate that. Don't wait for the fireworks or the breakthrough, or just celebrate each moment in that. As we do the points that are our lifeline, at each point, let us celebrate the goodness of God and the truth, beauty, and goodness. And I think that's significant. We can give opportunities. And that's what Henri did. He gave all of us an opportunity to grow and to come closer to the Lord and one another. And I love that. So life signs are what I look for. And
Henri so often spoke in movements to move from something towards something. And I think he would definitely be inviting us to shift and to move from these places of fear and separation and angst and anger and hatred and towards the house of love. So thank each of you for being present for this conversation, to Barbara and Peter and Michael and Jim, who were with Henri Nouwen at Harvard in the early 80s. All these years later, the deposits of beauty, of hope, of hospitality, of being Jesus-centered and being deep, deep friends clearly have borne much fruit. So thank you for being with us. And for those of you who are listening, never ever forget that you are the beloved of God.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Now and Then Again. If you enjoyed this conversation, we'd love for you to stay connected with the spirit of Henri Nouwen's work. You can sign up for free daily meditations from the Henri Nouwen Society at henrinouwen.org. They're a simple, thoughtful way to begin or end your day with a spiritual pause and an opportunity to welcome deep and faithful hope. And be sure to mark your calendars for May 14 to 16, 2026, for our upcoming international conference, Longing for Home, the prophetic witness of Henri Nouwen in a wounded world. You'll be able to participate in person in Toronto or online, joining a global community inspired by Nouwen's vision of compassion, justice, and belonging. Check it out, conference.henrinouwen.org. Until next time, thank you for listening to Now and Then Again. And never ever forget, you are the beloved of God.